Well, good evening, folks.
Good evening.
For joining us tonight on GCA's webinar series. This is the second of many to come in this series. We wanted to continue to provide that educational opportunity for our producers to learn more about our industry and specifically the trade and market forces that impact our industry on a daily basis. So tonight we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Kent Bacus, who is the Senior Director of International Trade and Market Access, as well as Mr. Tanner Beymer, the Director of Government Affairs and Market Regulatory Policy. We hope that you learn a little bit from tonight, but we will be also sending out a survey to everyone who has joined us for them to complete to help with the Cattlemen's Education Series grant that GCA has received. So with no further ado, I just want to turn this over right now to Mr. Kent Bacus to give us a overview of trade and how trade and tariffs impact the cattle industry. Mr. Kent.
Good evening, and thank you for letting us join you and talk about some of the most important issues facing our industry. One of those being trade. The other one is also cattle markets. And as most of you understand, with trade, it's one of the more complicated issues, and sometimes it's one of the most misunderstood as well. When you look at the importance of international trade, it's important to know where our beef is going, and it's also important to know what's coming in. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to do kind of a brief overview of what has happened in trade policy, what are some of the big wins, what are also some of the concerns that people have. And so we're gonna move quickly and cover quite a bit of ground, and definitely want to make time for all of your questions. So with that, let's go ahead and we'll turn to the first slide. And this really just kind of sets the stage. Coming into 2020, we were looking at a very positive year. We thought that this was going to be a great year to kind of turn the corner on a lot of things and make some major advances in the international market. We were set to really kind of take the world by storm. And unfortunately, COVID was the big gut punch that hit the entire industry. And we kind of had to put a lot of things on hold. Fortunately, we got a lot of agreements up and running, but we haven't really been able to jump in and capitalize on them just yet, because we had to dedicate almost all of our time and our resources towards addressing the urgent needs of our industry. And first and foremost, that was how we could just really try to triage a lot of the stress on our industry and try to provide our producers with a way to kind of bridge those hard times. We're still coming through that, but it looks like we are hopefully going to be pulling out and making that turn here pretty soon. And when that happens, we'll be able to really jump on some of the opportunities on the global economy. But as you can see from this slide, we've got a lot of things that we worked on, supporting the passage of CFAP, expanding the small business loans to give cattle producers access, working on the emergency CRP and forage access, for many of you getting the hours of service waivers so that we can continue to move cattle and move our products all the way through the supply chain and meet that demand. At the same time, keeping the packing facilities open and trying to keep the supply chain moving as smoothly as possible, all the while trying to maintain our free market principles and continue to not make any long-term decisions that could have significant repercussions. And by and large, I think the beef industry is coming through this better than most. Even though when we saw some tremendous losses especially on cattle prices. And, we continue to try to work through that backlog of cattle and try to hopefully reopen some of these restaurants where 50% of our sales are found. Hopefully we're going to be able to pull through that. But, coming into 2020, we were coming off of a really good year in 2019. And that's what we want to talk about right now. This is just a very high level snapshot of what we were able to secure along with the Trump administration. Probably one of the biggest things that happened to us was the signing and implementation of the trade agreement with Japan. The Japanese market is our biggest export market, represents about $2 billion in sales. We face a 38.5% tariff in that market. But because of the trade deal we have in place, that tariff rate is going to phase down to 9%. It puts us on a level playing field with all of our competitors, and it allows us to really capitalize on that growth in demand for high quality grain finished beef in the Japanese market. We also secured a major trade agreement with the Chinese, and we're going through that phase 1 implementation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. This was a landmark deal for us because we didn't have access to China. We had nominal access, but we didn't have real access where we could develop. We still faced a lot of non-tariff trade barriers. We still faced some pretty high tariffs, and that phase 1 agreement really addressed a lot of those. We are the shining star in that agreement, and that's something we're all very proud of. We also have a 35,000 metric ton U.S. specific beef quota in Europe. And at the same time, we also have the ratification and implementation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So when you look at Japan, China, and the EU, those are all agreements that gained us in a bigger footprint and definitely a stronger presence in other markets. The USMCA protects our investments in both Canada and Mexico, while updating the rest of NAFTA to bring it into the 21st century. So, overall, these were all major victories for us. This is a lot to squeeze into 1 year. When you look at trade policy, by and large, it takes several years to get one of these. We got 4 in 1 year. And so this is big. As you can see in these pictures too, NCBA was front and center with each of these. That's the signing of the Japan deal, and that's NCBA President Jennifer Houston in the orange blazer right there next to Ambassador Lighthizer, next to President Trump. And if you look the picture on the right, you see a cowboy hat in the background in the middle, and that's NCBA President Marty Smith. We've had a presence at a lot of these signing ceremonies, and that's because the beef industry and NCBA with our state affiliates have been front and center on all of these, trying to open these markets and create more opportunities for our producers. As I mentioned, the China agreement. This is, in many ways, all of these things were viewed as impossible to remove. These were the barriers that were going to really be just monumental trying to overcome. And when you look at what China did, how the administration worked with the Chinese government to get them to remove these non-tariff barriers. Folks, these are game changers for our industry. First of all, China lifted the BSE restriction that had been in place since 2003. As many of y'all remember, the cow that stole Christmas. China was still using that as leverage over us. They had a 30-month restriction in addition to just using BSE to keep us out for over a decade. When we got the access restored in 2017, we had bookend traceability requirements, and that's no longer necessary. That's huge because that's another compliance cost that we can push aside. It means that instead of having to have a China-specific program, we'll have greater access for most of the cattle that we produce, which means we can sell a lot of the same beef that we sell in the United States. We can export it without having to have a qualifier on top of that. One of the biggest things that happened, this is really just a groundbreaking game changer of a move was China recognizes the safety of U.S. beef and it has established a maximum residue level for synthetic hormones. Folks, this is big. China used that hormone ban. They implemented it as a law, which meant that it was illegal for any beef products from any country to test for this, which meant most of the world was complicit and said, okay, we're not going to use these technologies, even though the science backs it up and says it's safe. China, we've worked very closely with them over the years. They are trying to bring their standards more in line with the international guidelines. And so we're seeing the establishment of those MRLs. This opens up a lot more of our herd for the Chinese market. China is also conducting a risk assessment for ractopamine. This is going to be big when it finally goes through. As many of y'all know, this is a compound that's commonly used at our feed yards. It adds value. It's a safe technology. It's all FDA-approved technologies that we're talking about here. And the Chinese are finding a path forward for science and trade. That may not sound real flashy or like a big headline grabber, but these are some monumental shifts in policy that have really opened it up. And most importantly, we have some very strong enforcement provisions with the Chinese, so they can't just back out of the agreement overall. This is a really a big deal for us, and we look forward to being finally able to capitalize on that access to a fifth of the world's population that we didn't have access to before. So what's up next? What else have we done? We have these big victories. What else could we go for? Well, if we thought China was tough, here we are in merry old England and trying to deal with 40 years of European mindset that opposes technology in agricultural production, that opposes science. And so, we're having to be very direct in our conversations with the British. They are trying to leave the European Union, but they haven't necessarily left the European mindset. And so we're having a lot of conversations about science, just like we did with China, just like we did with Taiwan, just like we did with Korea, and just like we did with Japan. We are going to continue to push for science-based trade. And we think that we definitely have some very strong arguments. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to be able to tell our story to these British consumers. But we have a lot of similarities, not only in the breeds that we raise, but also in the manner of which we raise them. They have a program there called Red Tractor. Red Tractor is a quality control program that's marketed, and it really talks about animal welfare provisions and how well they treat their animals. Very, very similar principles and very similar application to what we have in the beef quality assurance program, which many of you are qualified and certified under. So we have a lot of similarities, more similarities than differences, and I think there's a lot of room for us to talk. But we're also going to have a lot of conversations about climate change. If you see that picture on the left, I actually took that photo in Trafalgar Square last October during the climate protests, and they shut down most of London with these climate justice protests. So if you ever go over there, there's not about 5 or 10 minutes that goes by that there's not a World Wildlife Fund video on, or polar bears on melting ice caps or something else like that. They get a steady diet of this climate change in their news, in their commercials, their advertising, and so we're going to have to do a really good job of talking about our sustainable practices here and what we do to lower our greenhouse gas emissions and how we care not only about our animals but the environment in which we raise them. And we do a really good job at that, but this is going to be a very tough conversation for us. The goal is to try to have these agreements wrapped up by the end of the year, but with this being an election year, I think the reality is that we're going to have a lot of negotiations, but it's going to be hard to move it across the line before the end of the year. So we've talked a little bit about exports, but with the onset of COVID, there has been a lot of concern about imports. There's been a lot of misinformation out there about imports are suppressing prices, and imports are what are causing these cattle prices to drop. without any actual evidence to support that, mind you. But I think it's important to realize the role imports play. We are not here advocating on behalf of beef production practices in other countries. We are here advocating for America's cattle producers. That is who we represent, and that is who we're part of. But I think we need to address the information about imports. I think it's important that we look at this from a very high level. So what are we importing? We are not importing high quality grain finished beef that is, pushing your muscle cuts away at the grocery store or at restaurants. What we are importing primarily is lean grass finished beef. Most of it goes in as a form of trimmings, and it goes in to make hamburgers. Dr. Peel from Oklahoma State had a nice little summary of this that came out last fall. It said 72% of beef imports are lean trimmings used primarily to make hamburger. And so when you look at that, we're importing a lot of this lean beef to meet that demand for ground beef. And, the same cuts that we would usually throw into the grinder, we're now selling at a higher value as flat iron steaks and other cuts that we have developed, through the beef checkoff and through other mechanisms. We're not in the quantity game. We're in the quality game, and we're trying to get the best price for that carcass, the best price for that animal overall. And for the most part, that lean beef, we have found ways to sell that as muscle cuts, the domestically produced stuff, as opposed to throwing it in the grinder where we're going to fetch a lower price. But at the same time, that ground beef is competing with chicken breast and with and other lower price proteins, and so there's that dynamic that we have to meet. For us to capture value with our fattier beef trimmings, and keep in mind about 95% of what we're slaughtering is going to be going through a feed yard, and we got some pretty well marbled animals these days. We need that lean trim to combine with our fattier trimmings so we can capture value on those trimmings. And that's really what this is about. But, hypothetically, what would happen if we just cut off imports? If we just said, okay, we're no longer going to import these grass finished trimmings from Australia, from New Zealand, which are our primary sources. It's not Brazil. It's not Namibia. It's Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, and Canada. Those are the major sources we import from. So what if we cut off imports? Well, this is actually a question that was addressed on a different webinar that North Dakota State University hosted in May, and I encourage you to watch this series if you get a chance. It's the Intersection of Cattle and Beef Industries webinar series. It's an excellent series that North Dakota State did in conjunction with they had West Virginia, Texas A&M, and a couple of other land grant universities. And it was a great webinar series. I strongly encourage you to go back and watch those if you get a chance. But on this one, this is one of the questions that was asked, and the result was that we would see a 45% decrease in ground beef. That's significant. It would also mean that we would have to take a lot of those muscle cuts, like we talked about, flat irons and tenderloins and other things like that usually fetch a higher price to keep meeting that ground beef demand. We'd have to throw those higher value cuts into a grinder. And the other alternative would be we would have to raise 10 to 15% of yearlings as range beef and sell as cull cows, which means that we're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table. And so it's, the way the market is pushing us, and the way that we've been able to stay profitable, is we maximize that overall carcass value, and we do that by combining our fattier trimmings with these lean beef trimmings. And so, I know people have different views on that. These are not NCBA facts that we're putting up there. These come from those land grant universities who've researched this, who are the real experts on it. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to look at both of these as great examples. And that webinar series covers a lot on imports too. And I would just encourage you to look at that if possible. So we have covered a whole lot on the trade side. Real quickly before we move into questions, I want to introduce my colleague, Tanner Beymer. Tanner is working on all of our cattle market issues, and he's probably been the busiest person in our office over the last few months with all the pressures on the market because of COVID, because of just this time of year anyway. So Tanner, why don't you just share a few points with the audience tonight?
Yeah, appreciate that, Kent, and thanks to Dale and the Georgia Cattlemen's for having both of us on. Kent hit a lot of good points on the international trade front, and I think that's important because trade is a very key component to a lot of the market-related issues that the cattle industry is facing right now. It's no secret that COVID-19 and the Tyson fire at the Holcomb plant in Kansas last year have been two major back-to-back black swan events that have put some downward price pressure on cattle markets. And that's something that NCBA is taking very seriously. We're keeping a pretty much daily tab on slaughter capacity and beef supply and cattle inventories and cattle on feed so that we can really get a good sense of where the market is at and where we can expect to see some recovery from those two black swan events. I know there are probably a lot of questions on that front, and I certainly don't want to take away from whatever questions you have for Kent this evening. But my role here this evening is to kind of assist Kent in answering some of those questions that you may have, and looking forward to some of the discussion. But mostly just thanks for having us. It's always a great opportunity, especially in this era of social distancing, to speak with folks that are on the ground and doing what Kent and I would much prefer to be doing rather than sitting here in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dale.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time tonight. We've got a couple of questions that have been submitted by our audience here. First off, you touched on several different things, Kent, but specifically, what safety protocols do other countries have to go through in order to sell beef in the U.S.?
That's a great question, and contrary to popular belief, they can't just fill out an application and get approved in a matter of weeks. In many ways, it takes years for these countries to be approved. Countries have to be deemed to have an equivalent safety standard to us. Doesn't mean they have to have the exact same laws, but it means they have to meet the same goals, and they have to be able to prove scientifically that they do it that way. Not everybody has a separate USDA and Food and Drug Administration. Some of them have it, just in one agency. So really the goal is to try to make sure that their standards are aligned with ours. And so it's up to these countries to show that they have a risk assessment protocol in place, that they have not only oversight of the animal health, but the food safety mechanisms. And they have to show that they can test and they can do all of the same testing capabilities that we can here in the United States. And the goal there is to make sure that any product that is going to come into the U.S. market meets the same threshold of safety that we require. And that way, when American consumers go to the store, they can feel confident, and when they purchase a product, that it's not going to make them sick. The United States takes a very different approach than a lot of the world because we try to make sure that the consumer has the least amount, that they have to do the least amount possible to make sure that product is safe. All that's done, before the consumer enters the equation. Whereas in Europe, in China, and other places like that, many times it's buyer beware. If you didn't cook it right, or if you got sick, it's because you didn't cook it right. It's not because there was something wrong with the product. Whereas here, we will do food recalls if we suspect that there is anything wrong. Very, very different approach to a lot of these things. And if someone's going to sell their products here, they have to show that they meet an equivalent standard of what we have. But that includes not only paper audits, but it includes on-site audits by our people. We go and we check all those things. By that I mean the U.S. government goes and we send our best and brightest to go and thoroughly inspect these facilities. And then they can lose that approval if there are issues. Case in point, even though NCBA raised a lot of concerns, and actually we became, pretty direct in our opposition to this with the government. The United States still approved Brazil to export to the U.S. And for about 6 months, they had approval, and they were able to start sending product here. But they had a lot of issues. They were finding a lot of foreign material, in some cases fecal matter in the Brazilian product that was coming up here. And obviously USDA shut that down immediately. And it took Brazil about 2.5 years to regain probationary access. And they're still under the microscope on a lot of things. And so if a country does not live up to our standards and doesn't live up to their expectations, we inspect all this stuff at the port of entry. And if there's anything wrong with it, then obviously that gets flagged. The shipments get rejected. They lose a lot of money on that. And there's an incentive for them not to screw up and not try to game the system. We also have an inspection process that's thorough enough that catches a lot of this stuff. And even if there's just a scratch in the box or a hole in it, they reject the shipment. Like this isn't one of those things where they go through and just find stuff wrong with the product. If there's something wrong with the packaging, a lot of times it gets rejected. United States has some of the highest standards. And so in many cases, it takes countries years. In Namibia's case, it took them 18 years to get approval. And that was numerous audits and rejections and things like that. At the same time, if a country has active cases of foot and mouth disease, if they have BSE, ongoing BSE issues and things like that, they're not going to have access to the U.S. And so those are all major risk to our herd, major risk to our consumers. The U.S. government doesn't stand for that. So as an advisor for the U.S. government, NCBA plays a very direct role in raising these concerns and talking about what the impact would be to our industry if we had these animal health issues, if we had food safety issues, because it's not just the health and the safety that's on the line, it's our reputation as well. When consumers go to the market, they need to know that when they purchase food, it's not going to make them sick. So that's a great question, and we could spend a whole webinar series talking about imports and the safety of those.
Sure. So, Kent, you just brought it up as part of your answer, and I want to throw this back to you. You mentioned Namibia as part of it. What's the reason? There was a lot of questioning as to why we were importing beef from Namibia. What might be another reason for a country to go after a U.S. approval?
So if you look at the access that countries like Namibia and Brazil have to the United States, they still, while they may have access to the U.S., it's very limited access. They have to compete for a 60,000 metric ton annual quota that charges, I believe it's 4.4 cents per kilo. And then once that threshold exceeds 60,000 metric tons, that tariff at 26.4%, that tariff kicks in, and it makes it, even more difficult to sell their products here. And Brazil, Namibia, the EU, most of the Caribbean countries, the Latin American countries, anybody that has access here, they're all competing under that one quota. So it's not like they each get 60,000 metric tons. It's a very small quota. So for most of these countries, it's not just that they want to be able to sell some beef trimmings here, because their quality's not, the quality doesn't stack up to what we're producing. It's not something that you're going to find at, nice grocery stores and restaurants and things like that. They're mainly just supplying the beef trim. But what they are looking for is essentially the United States to say this product is safe enough for our market. They take that stamp of approval and can go and show other countries like, look, well, we know the U.S. is the hardest country to get into, but if they say that we meet this threshold, then we think that you ought to allow us access. And you see that in a lot of third countries. But the U.S. is still the gold standard, still the highest approval process that's out there. Definitely one of the safest systems in the world. And so when you look at the reputation that we have, that's a very strong message that sends to the rest of the world.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that insight. And honestly, the way in which our standards have created a bargaining chip for other countries ought to be a testament to the strength and stability of our industry. Real quick, got a couple more. We hear a lot of back and forth on mandatory labeling requirements. Obviously, product of the U.S. has been in the news lately within our industry, but one of the common themes that we hear through this is that we're importing whole muscle cuts from other countries. We're taking it out of the package in a U.S. plant. We're putting it in a new package with a new U.S. sticker because that's all it requires. What are the standards and regulations regarding placing a voluntary U.S. sticker on imported beef?
Absolutely. This is probably one of the, I'd say pre-COVID and probably even during COVID, this is one of the most hot button issues that's out there. Is the concern over the product of the USA label. This is something that we have been investigating for well over a year, and we had talked with USDA about our concerns about the use of that label, because essentially what happens is a product comes in and it goes through an FSIS inspected facility. The threshold's pretty low for a retailer to be able to just put that product, the USA label, on there. We raised a lot of concerns about that because there's a lot of questions about, what justifies a product of the USA? But also, it also discourages having that lower threshold and the ease of using a product of the USA label. It discourages some of the branded products that we use, especially some of the regional products that we use. There's no evidence that really shows that adding that label moves any volume or anything else. But what it does is it creates a disincentive to enroll in some of our process verified programs. And so one of the things that we have tried to work with USDA to find is a way to make sure that any claim that's an origin claim would be verified. And if they can't verify it, they can't use it. I think that there's a difference in that and having what it would be a voluntary label as opposed to there being a mandatory label that was being used and being misapplied, because that essentially be the U.S. government marketing the product. So we have put some ideas forward to USDA. We're hopeful to see some kind of response from them. Obviously with COVID, that slowed some things down in the progress we were making, but we think it's important that that any time that claim is made, that first of all it is verified, and there are existing programs and methods within USDA to be able to do that, but also just make sure that we're not allowing a label to continue to be used that may send a confusing message to consumers, but also takes away from a producer's opportunity to really capitalize on one of those process verified programs. So we're hopeful to see that issue resolved. We don't really see a lot of value in having that product of the USA label, just like there wasn't a whole lot of value in having a mandatory country of origin label. There wasn't any evidence to show that actually drove demand for our products or built consumer confidence. We think that as an industry, we can market our beef better. We think that there are voluntary labels that we can use, especially regional labels that consumers are looking for. I think one thing that COVID has really brought forward is, it's opened people's eyes to the fact that they want to buy more. They want to buy from more local sources. They want to buy from their region, from their state, from their neighbors, and they want to know that they can get that steady supply. The way the rules are set now, there's not a strong incentive to do that. We think, though, if we can kind of if we can address that, if we can correct that standard and do that in a way that doesn't bring back a mandatory label, but have a verified voluntary label that's in place, that would be beneficial for both consumers and producers. And that's what we're going to try to work with USDA to find.
Well, you mentioned it there, with consumers wanting, and especially during the pandemic, shifting more demand back and forth to their neighbors, to their friends, to the people they see in their local communities who have cattle. Obviously, market becomes a big question, specifically what we've seen with COVID and the separation disparity between the cutout value and what producers are receiving on the hoof. Tanner, real quick, there's a ton of different thoughts and opinions and ideas being thrown out there right now, anywhere between the 50% cash mandate to the 30-14, bid to grid concepts. Can you walk us through some of the activities and actions that NCBA's members are doing to try and better the industry through the COVID process?
Absolutely. I don't think it's going to be a secret to any of your members on the webinar this evening that since about 2014, late 2014, early 2015, there has been a period of declining cattle prices as herd inventories have grown, and that has spurred a large conversation about price discovery. And that conversation definitely existed prior to the Tyson fire back in August of last year, where we saw, again, that same disparity in the price of cattle on the hoof and the price of the box beef cutout. What we didn't know at the time is that was going to pale in comparison to the price disparity that we saw between live cattle and the cutouts following coronavirus, between social distancing protocols at plants, temporary plant closures, line speed reductions for social distancing for those line workers. There was a period where the box beef cutout jumped to record high levels. And if you're a statistics nerd like myself, that was a differentiation of 20 standard deviations at the peak of the disparity between live cattle and the cutouts. And one thing that's important to realize is that most of those price disparity, as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic specifically, is derived from a supply and demand lack of equilibrium. You had a rapid decline in the amount of processing capacity, coupled at a time when there is significantly high retail demand for beef, leading into what was Easter, Memorial Day, and typical grilling holidays. So that is what drove the price of the cutout sky high and really spurred a lot of conversation within the industry about price discovery. Those two issues are separate, but they are also related. And I think that it is no secret that negotiated trade has been declining across all of the cattle trading regions in the country. The use of alternative marketing arrangements, be they formulas or grids or forwards, have increased in popularity as producers are realizing premiums for improvements in their cattle. And it's also important to note that that actually started back when beef demand was at a low back 20, 30 years ago. That actually started at the seed stock level, and they started to produce, they started to really focus on cattle genetics, and that's what led to some of these premiums that you see for certified Angus beef, for carcass traits on the rack. And that has in turn led to a decline in cash trade. And so one of the things that NCBA has been doing to try and spur more price discovery has been centered around this concept of negotiated trade. Dr. Stephen Kuntz from Colorado State University did a study. He is, in my opinion, the nation's foremost expert on the topic of cattle markets and price discovery. And he identified for each of the 5 USDA reporting regions certain thresholds for negotiated trade that needed to be met in order to facilitate price discovery and robust price discovery in those regions. And that is what Senator Grassley's 50/14 legislation in the Senate, and they now have a House companion to that bill, Representatives Finkenauer, Liebsack, and Axney from Iowa. And that is what kind of led to that piece of legislation. NCBA does not support that because we don't support mandates in the cattle markets, but also we think that any sort of a solution to this price discovery issue needs to be focused on a regional basis using the research that we have available to us at this point in time. So what NCBA has done to kind of foster that conversation and try and achieve some solutions to this overarching price discovery question is we put together a working group of NCBA members who are also very active in the live cattle marketing committee. And that working group has explored several options. We have had meetings with some of the big four packers to encourage them to trade more cash cattle. We have discussed utilizing negotiated grids as a means to facilitate price discovery and marrying those negotiated grids with some sort of what we're calling pedestrian access grid. One of the things we've talked about using is the Fed Cattle Exchange. And then we've also explored other ideas like a program that we're calling the Market Maker that was identified as an option by Dr. Kuntz in his research, which is a somewhat complicated program, but the simplest way to put it is that if price discovery is a service that all members of the cattle industry are utilizing, but it is only being provided by a small subset of cattle producers that are trading on cash, then those non-cash cattle traders would pay a premium for that price discovery that would be distributed out to those that are trading on a cash basis. These are just some examples of the solutions that the working group has been discussing, and we will actually be having a much more comprehensive discussion about all those topics and a couple other ones as well during our summer business meeting next week, as a matter of fact. So I hope to have some more progress to report, perhaps at a later date.
So thank you for that overview. GCA has also been working on this front pretty much since the pandemic started. We've created our own separate, smaller working group amongst the southeastern states. One, to really get a handle on this. A lot of these market proposals have been in the works for 5 or 6 years now. And so for us, it was important to focus and see how those different proposals would be impacting our individual cow-calf producers here in our state. And so GCA will have representation at NCBA's meetings next week in Denver. We are at the table, folks, and that's what you have to be in these trying times. So just know that we're doing everything that we can. At this moment, we've got about we're right at 45 minutes. We try and keep these a little short, so that way we are able to turn our members back to their own operations and families. But real quick, I'm going to do a quick unmute to see if anybody would like to ask any questions of either of these gentlemen. If you could and are interested in asking a question, I ask that you please state your name and where you're from, and give these gentlemen a little bit of background on your operation before you ask your question. Sometimes context helps a lot in forming their answers. So real quickly, just to open up the line for any questions out there.
Okay, am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. My name's Joe McGinnis. I live in Blairsville, Georgia. All right. We raise and sell at the farmer's market and at our farm store beefalo cattle. All right. You know when my next slaughter date is over in Raven Gap? Next February. And the one after that is next June 29th. What are you going to do about it? I mean,
well, first of all, I appreciate that question, and that is something that we're keeping a close eye on. One thing that NCBA did at the very early onset of the pandemic, when processing capacity fell down to about the worst levels that it got to during COVID-19, was we successfully lobbied the White House and got President Trump to sign an executive order which used his authority under the Stafford Act to designate meat packers as an essential enterprise and to help clear some of the regulatory red tape and keep those plants open even while states were closing down and there were stay-at-home orders and in some extreme cases lockdowns. That was very helpful in ensuring that processing capacity stayed at somewhat manageable levels. But with respect to your slaughter dates being so late in the year, believe me, that is a very complicated question, and it's one that we're trying very hard to address. One thing that we have been able to get done in the last couple weeks is with Chairman Peterson of the House Agriculture Committee, was he introduced a piece of legislation called the Ramp Up Act. And you'll have to forgive me because I can't recall exactly off the top of my head what Ramp Up actually stands for. But basically what that would do is it would allow for facilities that are currently not USDA inspected, so they're either state inspected or custom exempt facilities, which currently are not allowed to sell in interstate commerce. It would allow them to receive federal grants to become USDA compliant and USDA inspected, which would open up new markets and hopefully increase the processing capacity that some of those smaller facilities have. That has been introduced in the House. We are expecting Senate introduction perhaps as soon as the end of this week. I know that is not that's not something that is going to immediately remedy that situation, but hopefully that is something that will help to move the ball forward on increasing this processing capacity. There are other legislative proposals that we're looking at to increase processing capacity, as well as open up some opportunities to perhaps sell direct to consumer over the internet. Those are other legislative proposals that are floating around on Capitol Hill right now. But realistically, the best thing that we can hope for right now in terms of the macro markets is for processing capacity to come back up online. We are about on par, within about 5% plus or minus, depending on what the week is, with 2019 levels of slaughter capacity. And we are fortunate right now because after the 4th of July, that is a period where there's not as much beef demand because we're between holiday seasons. Retail demand is low. Food service demand is still very low because some of these states are going back in their reopening phases due to resurgences of the virus. And we have seen a lot of our meat packers be able to continue with high slaughter rates that are not seasonally normal for this time of year. So I hope that answers your question. I know that that's probably not what you're wanting to hear, but rest assured, this is something that we are keeping our eyes on very closely and constantly looking for additional solutions.
And this is also something that Congress is very eager to address to make sure that we can maximize the slaughter capacity that's out there and increase it, and also to make sure that we can take some of the pressure off of the big four that control about 85% of the processing. So we need to diversify that. I think that there have been some real weaknesses that have been exposed. Part of being big and efficient industry is the fact that when you have setbacks in these different areas, it hurts more. And so that's definitely something we want to be able to make sure we don't have those mistakes in the future. I don't think, obviously no one saw all of this, coming and really expected the impact like it did, but, we can make moves now and make decisions now that will hopefully ensure that we won't go through the same problems that we did over the last few months.
And the last thing I'd say is that Congressman Bishop from your state has been very helpful. He's the chair of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture. He's been very helpful in our efforts to get some of these programs teed up.
Mine's the niche market, I understand, but we sell local. But see, I have to sell them on halves and wholes, custom cut for the local market. Processing market here, he's only like 4 miles down the road. Otherwise, USDA, I have to provide 60 miles over to Blaylocks, and then 60 miles back, 60 miles over, 60 miles back, and and I can't sell by the pound, using the local fella, and he does a good job when I sell one on the custom cut.
Well, Mr. Joe, one thing from GCA's perspective, obviously, both Kent and Tanner here have alluded to it, but one thing that COVID showed us is that we can't rely on the other states' processing capacity to meet our needs and demands here. And so that's one thing that GCA, in addition to everything else, has been adding to our plate, is trying to figure out how we can expand our processing capacity, not only looking at at adjusting how the existing processors are able to sell their, to work through the process and being able to sell as the RAMP Act would allow for, but also how do we find capital? It's extremely cost prohibitive to create and start up a processing plant. So how do we find that capital that allows producers some skin in the game and some ability to help direct the future of their own enterprises and being able to have that ability. And so that's one thing that we continue to work on. It's obviously it's not an overnight solution. It seems like it was an overnight problem that snuck up on us, but at the start of this pandemic, and this is one of the rare times in our industry's history that we have had a record number of cattle in the feedlot. We have had more cattle than we can process, and we recognize that as an issue. That is a problem that we're committed to solving, and that's something that we got to get right from the start. We can rush in and try to wave a magic wand and throw something at the wall and hope it sticks. But if we don't do this right, we're going to be paying for it as an industry for decades to come. So just know that GCA is working on it. I'd love to have a conversation with you after the call to go through it and see if we can't figure out some way to help improve the situation there. But again, appreciate that question. Are there any others? All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for your participation tonight. This is part of our producer education series, so you will be receiving an email with a survey. We ask you to please take the moment, just fill it out. Let us know how this webinar series went. Your feedback helps to inform future webinars and making sure that we get the right information to the right to our producers in a timely manner. So again, we want to thank both Mr. Kent Bacus and Tanner Beymer for their time this evening. We know they've got incredibly busy schedules, but maybe we have delayed your leave from the office long enough to miss the rush hour traffic up there. So, gentlemen, thank you again for your time tonight. Thank you for all who attended, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.